Hello, and welcome to the Adventures in Arting podcast, where we analyze, explore, and celebrate the creative journey. My name is Julie fei-fan Balzer, and I'm a working artist living outside of Boston. I've been hosting this podcast with my super special co-host and my mom, Eileen Balzer, since 2012. Hi, Mom.
Hello, Julie.
So I've got 2 in-person classes coming up. The first is Funny Faces, Creating Portraits with Personality. It's this weekend at the Monastery Gallery of Arts in Connecticut. So that's Saturday, May 4th, 2024 from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. All materials are included, as well as lunch for $135. It's a great deal. And we're going to be making all sorts of expressive faces. So whether you've never created a face before or you've done it a million times, you're going to be creating some really fun mixed media collage faces. And then June 23 through 25, you can pamper yourself with a 3-day class at my home studio. I'm teaching art alchemy, exploring golden brand paints and mediums. In case you don't know, I am a certified golden artist educator, and I am going to teach you all about the different golden brand paints and mediums. You're going to leave with a huge reference guide that you'll be able to use to know like which mediums and paints work for you in your art practice versus what doesn't. So you can sign up for that at Balzer Designs. Actually, that's not true. You can sign up for that at juliebalzer.com. The curse of having so many different websites for people to go to. The curse of being your own webmaster is what it really is. If I were not just Googling how HTML works all the time, I'm sure somebody could make it, fix it for me, who's an actual professional. But that is what we do when we're working on a shoestring. Okay, so this is episode 151, which I have titled 4 categories of art. And as always, Mom and I spoke earlier today, and she said, I don't get it. What is this about? And I said, well, why don't I explain it to you during the podcast, and then we'll see if you get it during the podcast, and we'll see if that helps. So I'm going to do a little bit of a backstory first, and I also want to say the following. This was a kind of mind-blowing thing to me. It really also helped me like feel better about some things that have happened to me in the past and understand and gave context to a lot of things. I also want to say as background that my mother is a trained anthropologist. And my grandfather is an anthropologist, and I actually think that this is kind of an anthropological breakdown of this. But here we go. So I stumbled across a post from someone named Dr. Louise R. Mayhew on Instagram, and I immediately started following her because I think it was really interesting. So her handle, if you want to follow her, is at Louise, that's with an E, Louise R. Mayhew. And so her Instagram bio says she's an art consultant, and her website goes a little further and says she's an art historian, a writer, editor, and a creative mentor. So the post that caught my eye that I started to read said, did you know that there's more than one art world? And I thought, I mean, not really. So why don't I look? So she goes on to basically divide the art world into 4 categories. And those categories are experimental, traditional, retail, and community. So I've mucked around with her definitions a little bit to fit. I mean, she, I believe, is out of Australia. And so they have some different verbiage in some different kinds of ways that I think the art world works there than it does here. So I've mucked around with a little bit. You can obviously see all her originals on her Instagram page, but here are the sort of mucked around definitions that make sense to my brain. So basically, experimental artists make work that critically engages with their field. So it's research, critical theory, exhibition essays, all this kind of stuff, which is really central to their work. It's, typically work that you see in like museums. It's often called like elite, conceptual, political, all that kind of stuff. And it's the kind of conceptual work that you're scratching your head about and saying like, what? This? And somebody else is explaining to you how it's actually brilliant and it's based in years of something and it's a commentary, and you go, what? So that's really, I think, what experimental art is. It's often so like, as much as people call it like elite and stuff like that, people will say it's unskilled. A child could do that. Like, it's the stuff where you're staring at a blank white canvas going, what is this? It's art that you're meant to really like talk about that is highly conceptual and very based in text, context, things being written about it, etc.
And it
Okay, so
also
yeah,
include art that's like movement art or video or, you
I
know,
think so. I think like a lot of new forms of art are often labeled in the experimental. Like there was a period of time when impressionism would have been considered experimental, right? And now it's just like in the canon of very traditional artwork. So a lot of basically contemporary art museums is where you're going to go to see this conceptual art, often interdisciplinary, as like mom is saying too, right? Okay. So
one
I
time
hinted
a
into,
shark
yeah.
in formaldehyde would have been wow, but now it's like, oh, another shark in formaldehyde.
Right. And actually, one of the things that she said about Damien Hirst, who is the shark and formaldehyde thing later on, which is like it was experimental, but one of the reasons people call him a sellout is because he's actually become a retail artist in some ways. So
Okay.
that's interesting because she's talking about when you move categories, how people feel about you. Because generally speaking, like experimental artists don't make a ton of money off their work until they get to the museum level. So they spend a long time in their early careers, collectors aren't buying it. And it's like, it's not until a museum acquires, a Richard Serra sculpture that he's making his money.
So people move in and out of this category, and success might actually move you from one category to another. Time
Yes.
is another thing. So, and whether people are copying you might also be an influence.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of reasons. And people also sometimes have a practice that splits categories. Like it's not so black and white, which is one of the things I like that she talks about actually over 3 Instagram posts. But so like in understanding the categories, the next category is traditional, which it is true that a lot of experimental art moves in traditional after time. Like it just doesn't seem cutting edge to us anymore. It doesn't seem experimental. It seems expected and normal. Fauvists are not like crazy mad wild animals. They're just like brightly colored paintings of mostly realistic scenes. Okay, so that falls
So,
into traditional.
so these categories are not about the quality of the art.
No,
These are more about like the
I think they're more about
ideas, the
intention.
mediums, the presentation, the acceptance.
Yes, and there's a big thing that she goes into about that too. So, traditional artists make art for exhibiting and selling to art collectors. It doesn't mean that their work isn't in museums, right? But like it's high-end artwork. It is like they are thinking that there's a buyer at the other end of it. So, originality, professionalism, prestige, sales, the art market, working with art dealers and commercial galleries, like that's very central to their work, right?
Okay.
And their art is made usually for commercial galleries and commissions, usually enters private collections. David Hockney is an example that Dr. Mayhew gave in her post, along with a lot of other artists. And you can see how like a Hockney piece is beautiful, and skilled is another thing that people say. They're often very expensive. It's considered an investment. Some people categorize it as like lobby art or couch art. Like it's something that you can see it in a hotel, you can see it in a big office like entryway. Like that's traditional art, and traditional artists usually make money from their art, right? It may have some conceptual factors, but it's easy for you and me, you know, Joe Normal, to stand in front of it and say like, "Oh, I get this. I know what this is about." Right? So, community is a very interesting category. Basically, community artists facilitate art making for participants. So, things like access and inclusion, connection, creativity, social justice, that's all like central to their work. It's like often described as sort of amateur, collaborative, communal, craft, design, DIY. It's participatory, art for well being, art for mental health, like all these kinds of things. Community artists may or may not make money, and usually it could be like a salary from an institution or a grant that you get from a community or a fee that someone pays you to come, but it's usually made in community spaces, and it's not normally exhibited, or if it is, it's only usually seen in the community space.
So does folk
So,
art fall into this category? And then
so
when
this
does it move into another category?
So this is interesting because folk art, I believe, starts in community and then can move out into both retail and traditional, depending on a number of factors. There was also a comment which I put in the notes that we can talk about later that somebody left saying, "Where does outsider art fall into it?" And Dr.
Right.
Mayhew essentially said, like, outsider art is outside of it because it's outsider. And that is the interesting thing. And there's lots of stuff that sort of doesn't quite fit into any
Yeah,
one.
that's not a good answer because you
Okay, that's not a
answer
good
the
answer to you.
definition. I know, I'm just saying not for me because you answer the definition with a definition, same definition.
Right. Although I have to say, I think the thing about um, outsider art is that I think it's generally like folk art begins in community and then depending on sort of the outcome of it, so to speak, then it changes what category it might fall into. I think
So
that
these
most people
categories are
who
the way we look at this
Mhm.
piece of art now.
Yes, this is how we're looking at this art now. And I think like we'll talk about this a little sort of in the way I designed it to think about like why these categories matter or how they're useful. But I find some of it to be really helpful just in terms of making me like understand why my art works in one space and not another, why it's appropriate, for some things and not others, why I get certain reactions. Anyway, we can talk about it later. Let's just get through
Okay,
retail
because
and
the
then
first
we'll
thing that
get
came to
into it.
my mind was, is cave art, Paleolithic cave art, is that
Cave art's
outsider
community
art?
art.
Is that community art?
I think cave art's
No, no, no.
community art. Cave art was an act of trying to communicate, right? Or to make records or to do any of that. And I think that kind of art because like, collaborative art in a lot of ways, inclusive, participatory, like all that kind of stuff, I think falls into community art.
Although, then you'll have people who are considered traditional, say Titian or someone, who had a whole atelier full of people who did all sorts of parts of the same of his paintings. So is that collaborative?
No, that's
I'm
retail.
just saying, I'm not objecting to this as long as we
Mhm.
get to where it will be useful to me to have these four categories in my mind. So let's go
I
on. But
understand that.
let's say everything.
The problem that I always have in this conversation with you is that I want to get through like the ground rules and you want to talk about like the high level thoughts before we've gotten through the ground rules. So let's just finish the ground rules and then we'll do it, okay?
Is that a
So
big difference between us? I actually think you're in some things you're the opposite because let's say you get something that you have to put together like an IKEA something. You don't read
mhm.
the directions. You want to just go and do it. So
That's
that's a
true, but
difference.
I'm usually not making IKEA furniture for an audience. And I guess I think of it very much as like, I want to make sure that everybody's coming on. This is the teacher in me, that everybody's coming along for the conversation so that we're not talking about stuff before like we're all understanding, it, especially since you've read the document. It feels like cheating.
I
But
accept this.
so retail artists make art for selling to everyday buyers and or to grow their audience for the purpose of selling something else, tickets, courses, influencer products, your package of, Nova paints, whatever it is. So entrepreneurialism, interior decorating, design trends, marketing, branding, PR, media coverage, and audiences are really important to their work. Their work is typically sold through non-art retail spaces, meaning shops, gift shops, that kind of stuff, arts and crafts markets, online via the artist website, socials, third-party websites such as Saatchi Art or NFT platforms, or on products. Now you're talking about service design artists are essentially retail artists, right? So retail artists plan to make money from their art. Like from the very beginning, it is I'm in this category because I want to make money from my art, right? Their work is often described as anti-elitist, it's skilled, it's commercial, it's consumable, craft design, viral stunts. And I've had people say to me things like, "Oh, this is super commercial, this work," which I now find very interesting. And so in her second
Do you
post,
find
Dr.
it
Mayhew,
insulting? I'm just wondering.
yeah, am I what?
Do you find it insulting or not?
I don't find it insulting. I don't
Okay.
find it insulting at all. But that's also because, like, I am not an experimental artist and I am not actually interested in being an experimental artist. I think so, just category wise, I'll just say this. After looking at these categories and thinking about them for a while, I think that I fit into the retail category with aspirations to be a traditional artist. So that is everything's about making money for good or for bad, you know what I mean? That's where I am. And I, am sometimes a community artist as well, but my focus is really much more in entrepreneurialism, building this business, and then I would like to have a business that is also about catering to higher end clients eventually, right?
So again, let's go back to something. So some of the traditional artists that we think of, let's say
Hmm.
Bernini or something, he could also be considered at the time he was a commercial artist because he was making art for a customer.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing. MC Escher never was considered an artist, a fine artist in his lifetime. He was always considered a retail artist because he was an illustrator, and illustrators often get put in this category because they're, just for whatever reason, they're not considered fine artists. And so I think that over time, of course, you've seen MC Escher exhibits and you understand a lot of stuff, but some of it is an intellectual snobbery, shall we say, because a lot of times both traditional and um, experimental artists have a lot of verbiage behind why they do what they do and what drives them, where retail artists often are making art that is aesthetic. And for whatever reason, if it's purely aesthetic and made to sell, there is less of, pardon me, and sort of an intellectual respect for it, which is a whole separate issue, but interesting to know. So I'm going to read a couple. I cut up a bit of her Instagram post to quote out of her mouth because I thought there were some interesting sound bites in it, explaining why the set of division matters. Then I thought I'd talk a little bit about why it matters to me, and then maybe, Mom, you could talk a little bit about how it might help you or how you maybe disagree with it. So Dr. Mayhew says this is important because knowing which art world you're in and how your art world relates to the others will help you to determine which activities, galleries, mentors, and peers are most useful to growing your practice. And more importantly, which activities from outside your world are beneficial, neutral, or even detrimental to your goals. So, said another way, activities that are perfectly normal and sensible for one art world might be questionable if you belong to another art world and the two worlds don't pair well. For example, honing an artist statement with critical ideas is useful for experimental practices, but might confuse retail audiences. Hosting studio visits for gallerists is valuable for traditional practices, but isn't necessary for community practices. And then she concludes by saying, but what's really important is you get to decide which art world you're in. Your art world is determined by what you do in the studio, how you talk about your art, where you show your work, who you network with, etc. If you want to be in a different art world to the one you're in now, you have the power to make that change. And so
So
I
you have to pick one, or can you
no.
see that your art could go back and forth? I mean, you might make something thinking that it's traditional, but then it ends up getting purchased for uh, a fabric design. So then
Yes.
it's crossed into something else.
She does have a post that's all about hybrids, people who go back and forth through categories. Some of the reasons that people who go back and forth through categories are like called sellouts and other people aren't, why that is based on how they travel or in what context they travel. And so there's a lot of like there's a lot of nuance and more complicated stuff if you really wanted to dig down into it. But I think like the way that it's useful to me is, so I remember about a year ago, I had a bunch of meetings with some gallerists where they looked at my work. And the biggest feedback that I came away with from that was one, they wanted me to work bigger. And two, that they were very interested in talking about sort of like why. why am I making this art? How is this art relevant? Kind of like, what is that? And I realize now with perspective and time that a lot of that was based in the fact that I was showing what is this was essentially both sort of retail and community work to a space that was looking for either experimental or traditional work.
And to
And
me,
that,
this is not a slam on gallerists,
yeah,
but they're in business to make money from selling your art. So
they
they're
are.
thinking of the marketing issues around
Mhm,
what work they put in their gallery. And the
mhm,
size is one thing, because if you walk by a lot of galleries, you'll see,
mhm.
in order to capture the eye, even from outside through the windows, they need large art. And then the second thing is they want to be able to say something about the art that you wouldn't know just from looking at it, that again will capture the purchaser's interest.
Yes, and I had another round of portfolio reviews more recently in the last month, this time with a bunch of people who run galleries or small art museums, right? And they're so who are much more in a
University
different kind of
galleries are a lot of
curatorial.
time. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
Many of them were university run
Yes.
university
So
galleries.
so they're more in the sort of not necessarily looking for stuff that is either retail or going to make money, but stuff that is more sort of intellectually interesting, has some sort of heft. And I actually had a lot more success because one big thing I've worked on this year is beefing up all of the statements around my work, the thought process around my work, the ability to talk about my work, the intellectual content of my artwork. And I see now that I knew that was something I had to do, but this has really clarified for me kind of why and how it could help me. And I do also think that when I think about you know, where I want to go with my art, or, how my business operates or any of that kind of stuff, I find these categories really useful for understanding why, like, I'm not going to have work at Mass Mocha no matter how, like, sort of big and talented, or if I were to blow up tomorrow as the next big thing, because I don't do that kind of experimental work, you know? And so that's just an interesting thought to have in my mind. And it also helps me to understand that different art schools turn out different kinds of artists, because I can see that certain schools turn out artists who are absolutely going into the experimental art world, and other art schools turn out artists who are ready to go into the retail art world, and and others turn out tradition, like on and on and on. And that you have to kind of know entering into it what kind of category you want to end up in, because that's how you're going to get network, that's how you're going to get taught, those are the connections you're going to make, all that kind of stuff. So I just find this interesting because I think it's really helpful, because it verbalizes something unseen that I wasn't able to verbalize myself.
In a way, these categories are kind of marketing categories.
Yes.
The art itself can move in and out of these categories. It's
Hmm.
almost like these categories are measuring what is going on in the art world today,
Hmm.
which was different from yesterday and will be different tomorrow. So it's a way of helping you as an artist figure out where to concentrate your efforts.
I agree. And then, so in the third part of the series of these Instagram posts, she has a series of charts that show art's intellectual, financial, popular, and social good hierarchies. So, like, retail art's the most popular, right? Those are the people that have like 1.2 million followers on YouTube who watch them, do you know what I mean, make something. Intellectual, always like experimental art's going to be at the top of it. Social good, community art is right at the top of that hierarchy, and then financial, traditional, you know hits it. That's what, people are, that's where the big money is. Now, she also makes some good points about why certain snobberies exist in the art world. And then some people in the comments are smart and intelligent, of course, and bring up all sorts of issues of like class bias, the ways that certain categories are described, elite, intellectual, commercial, kitschy, like that has a lot of class stuff embedded in it. And then there was just some notable comments I thought that I would bring up to talk about. So, a woman named Doris Kaffner said, "Oh my God, thank you. I run into a lot of artists that don't get this. Then they don't understand why their work isn't a good fit for a space. It's not even that one is better than another, but they are definitely different paths. I've started using sports analogies to try to explain it since somehow that helps people understand." And I thought, oh, of course, like you can be a pro athlete but you play football or you play soccer or you play baseball, like they're different worlds, they're related, and you might know each other and you might like meet up together, but like each of those worlds has its star, has its rules, has its leagues. That just makes so much sense to me. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and oftentimes the skills that are required change because the game does change.
Yeah. And people's interests, like some people watch any sport with a ball, any sport with a ball, they're going to watch, right? And other people are like, no, I am a hockey watcher, or I am a basketball watcher. Like that's the thing I care about, or I'm this team. And I think like that's collector tastes too, you know?
Curling.
Yeah, curling is for me. So Saren Dobkins says, or it could be Saren, I don't know. Is the medium, for example, oil on stretched canvas, like traditional, or is it the content on the medium, which could be experimental in approach? Like which is it? Is it the medium or the content? And so Louise R. Mayhew responded and said an oil painter can belong to any of these four art worlds. What positions an artist in one world or another goes beyond artwork, medium, or genre to things like how the artist thinks and talks about the art, how they engage with or ignore art history, where they show, how they market themselves. And this makes me actually think of your folk artist question as well as your outsider art question, because so often those artists, they don't think and talk about it in the context of the art world. They're not necessarily engaging with art history, they're not necessarily showing or marketing themselves. And so they defeat the system in some ways because they don't engage with it, right? And so I think that's the thing, like you can Bob Ross is probably a retail artist. That's the category. And you can paint all the happy little trees that you want. And then there's another oil painter who's going to sit in the experimental category, and another one who's going to be in the community, and another one who's going to be in the traditional, and they're all painting happy little trees, but there's something about the intellectual content, about where they're showing their work, probably the size of it, like all that kind of stuff that changes it.
And the sometimes when remember there've been a couple of movies and plays and books about people who fooled the art world for many years and were able to fake various artists and got authenticated because
Mhm.
their paintings were so good, and it leads
Yeah.
you to understand that often one of the things that's valued is not the actual work but who did it, and
Mhm.
that can make an enormous difference in how people value it. And then the other thing is, I am addicted to Antique Roadshow. I'm probably not the only person in this conversation who is. And what has happened often is someone will bring in something that is folk art that they got. They stumble across someone who is selling little paintings for $10 in their yard, and then now, many years later, this folk artist has achieved some fame, and that's why the value of the item that they're bringing into Antique Roadshow has gone up so much. So I think these categories are useful for thinking about what you should do as an artist
Mhm.
to find the audience and the market, etc., where you
Mhm.
will be accepted. But I do think there is an element also of financial uh, there's a financial scale, and the more this person gets for their art and the more they engage in that really high-end commercial art market, the more they are somehow touted as a great artist, and it's it's a mysterious world to people from the outside because you don't realize how much the art market really is dependent on who you know, luck. Do you have an interesting personal story? Did you hit the subject that is hot right now? Uh, I just think that is why sometimes people don't feel qualified to judge a piece of art because they feel that there's more going on than just looking at the art and saying, I like it, I don't like it, but they're not hooked into all these other issues. It's uh, it's very mysterious to a lot of people, including me, when you're
Well,
outside that inner
I
market.
think that this really, to me, helps make it less mysterious.
Okay,
And
that's good.
I think it's also important to understand that she's very clear about the fact that experimental artists basically don't make money until they get to the very top of their game and their work is being bought by institutions, you know? And that and yet they're considered at a greater intellectual level than, let's say, community artists who also don't make money with their art, you know because the belief is that they're putting intellectual content behind what they're doing as opposed to aesthetic. And again, we can get into why certain things are valued more than others, why you know, money matters, like da 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 da, solve all the problems of humanity. But I think this is so demystifying to me. It's like raising a curtain that I find really fascinating.
Well, it gives you
Um,
a method to figure out where to put your
mhm,
energy depending on your goals. So I think that's
yeah,
good. As long as one does not allow these categories to become rigid silos, because they're
I
not.
agree. And actually, so I wrote down the answer to the question that somebody asked about outsider art. So somebody named Capitan O Laura asked about where she would place, outsider arts, etc. And one of the things that Dr. Mayhew said is that, along with saying that it goes outside, she also says that there are some scenarios where the outsider work is co-opted by the experimental and traditional art worlds after the fact, right? And then that kind of outsider art actually becomes inside the system. Jacob Lawrence is basically, I think, falls into the traditional art category now, even though he was an outsider artist in his lifetime.
Well, it's interesting because this woman who wrote these blog posts is an
Mhm,
Australian, and they're having a resurgence of not only interest in Australian Aboriginal art, but some things I was reading about architecture now in Australia, and that these large
mhm,
public buildings are required to have some uh, portion, some interest in the actual architecture, some relation to Aboriginal art.
mhm,
Some, and I think that's a really evocative thought.
mhm. I will say Aboriginal art is also interesting because I can think of it like there's a community version of Aboriginal art. There's definitely a retail market of Aboriginal art. There's also certainly an experimental Aboriginal art practice, and there is a traditional Aboriginal art practice. So you can't even say hey, if you make Aboriginal art, you fit into X category because you don't. Because it again depends on all that stuff you're dragging behind you. How do you think about it? How do you talk about it? How do you market yourself? Where do you show your work? All that kind of stuff.
Well, that brings me
Um,
back to Antique Roadshow because one of the things that happens is people will bring in things, say it's a Native American item or it's an African item,
mhm,
and one of the things that seems to often lessen the value is if it was made for trade
mhm,
as opposed to made for their own personal use.
mhm,
So there are just a lot of factors that go into all that, and
mhm,
I think maybe this woman has stumbled on a way to uh, make these four categories useful to the working artist, not necessarily to a buyer or a viewer, but to actually the working artist.
I think it can be useful to a buyer or viewer because if I tell you we're going to an art museum, it is filled with experimental art. Experimental art is going to be stuff that is highly conceptual, it's pushing at the edges of things, it's generally not considered skilled art, and it is, often like confronting you with an idea. Then I feel like you're ready to walk into the contemporary art museum with a different attitude. And then I say to you, but, after that, we're going to go to the MFA, where you see much more of a traditional art practice. And we're going to see a lot of pictures of people on horses and, beautiful furniture. And like, you know what I mean? Like, you're just ready for it in a different way. I also think it can be helpful to people for understanding why certain art is kind of like worth more, or people think of it in a certain way. Because like I think anytime you understand the categories of things, it's just easier to get your brain wrapped around other people's ravings or craziness about it?
Well, these categories are lots based on what other people like.
Yes.
I mean, again,
Um,
it's marketplace categories. Not That's not
it
a
is.
slam on it. It's just that's what it is.
Well, I think this is the thing, which is she very clearly says, like, there are, like, when you talk about the art world is a financial market.
Right.
And at the end of the day, like this is somewhat the thought I think behind the Planet Money podcast, which if you don't know that podcast from NPR, it's so good. It relates everything in the world out to money. Everything in the world. One of my pardon me, one of my favorite episodes was when I learned about how the science of paleontology has been forever transformed by the price that T-Rexes, now bring in. It used to be that when you found a dinosaur skeleton, you would give it to a museum. Now you sell it to a private collector. So now the bones aren't coming in for public view, and they're not even coming in for public research. They're just going out to private millionaires and billionaires who want to own a T-Rex skeleton, and how that's damaging, science and paleontology and all sorts of stuff, right? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is, yes, everything at the end relates out to money. And if you want to be outside of the money structure, then I think that's what a lot of experimental artists have decided. That is, if they want to be purely experimental, then they have to not be in the financial, hold of having to make work that is commercially viable. And I think community artists also fall into that, where they say, like, I am interested in making art for reasons other than financial remuneration. And so I'm sitting happily in the community section. I think where we run into a problem is when you think like that if you don't make money from it, it has no value. And that seems like a you problem that you need to fix mentally, to understand that it's okay not to make money at lots of things. It's okay not to be a professional at lots of things. It's okay to be a professional at something and still not make money. This is like, from my theater background, there are people who are actors who are not currently acting in things, and that's okay, because you know what? They're still actors. And people who want to say that you have to define yourself by how you make money. Am I not a mother? I don't make money from being a mother. Am I not a daughter? Am I not a sister? Like, I think it's just such a ridiculous thing that people do, to like say that money is the only way that we can define what we do, who we are, how we're valued. I know a lot of people who make a lot more money than I do, and I can tell you I'm better than any of them. No, what I wanted to say is that it's like, do you think you're literally a better person than someone who makes less money than you? And if you do, once again, that seems like a you problem that you need to fix, because that's just not true. It's just not true. I think like the intrinsic value of people has to be something so much more than how much money they can bring in. So that's this whole
My
separate rant.
God.
Anyway, so Sally Chippendale, who has the best name, left this comment that I thought was a good one. She said, as an artist that is mainly focused on portraits and figures, I feel compelled towards competitions or commissions. But it's taken a year of experimenting to see where I fit. And interestingly, it's not retail unless I add a bird on the shoulder of the figure. It also feels like there is the internet art world and the in real life art world, and they are two separate mountains to climb. I love your detailed breakdowns. I've saved it to come back later. And I pinched this comment because I thought it was interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is the things she says has taken a year of experimenting to see where I fit. I actually think a year is a very short amount of time, and I think it can take you a lot longer than that to bounce around and see like what category do I fit into? Where do I feel comfortable, you know? And then I thought it was also I'm not going to say surprising because I think I could have guessed this, but she says it's not retail unless I add a bird on the shoulder of the figure. There is something certainly that people like about things that are cute or feel comfortable and that they want to buy. And I can tell you that most of the work that sells out of my online shop is stuff that falls into the kind of like cute, pretty, category. And of course, I'm not putting it down because I made it and I think it's beautiful, but that's the work that really sells fast out of there. And like I made a piece yesterday and I looked at it and I went, "Oh my god, it's so retail art. Like it's so retail coded." And it was just a good mental thing for me because I thought, "Well, what is it about it that is that? How could I make it more interesting? What do I want to how do I want to change it? What can I do?" And think about it that way. And so that has been helping me just to think about my own work in that context. I wrote a couple questions, but we've actually already answered them all, which is great because I was saying like, do you agree with these categories? How do you think it's, useful or helpful? And where do you think you fall in the categories? Can you be a hybrid? Like all this kind of stuff. But I think we've really talked about it. I mean, so mom, now that we've talked about it, do you feel like you understand this idea of these four categories?
Yes, if I think of it this way, they are a sliding scale. And part of the thing that moves the scale one way or another is the marketplace, history, your time in history, what's relevant and current, what people are interested in saying about themselves when they acquire this art. Because acquiring art has, for some people, become a huge way of saying, this is what I'm about.
Mhm,
Uh, so you're allying yourself with a particular group
mhm.
of people or philosophies just by your owning the art.
Yeah.
Um,
There is a art consultant that I know, and she said to an artist that she works with a lot, she said, who has a very good career selling a ton of work. So she's a very strong retail artist. And I mean, she easily sells six figures of work, or, like I think mid six figures of work a year, really, really well. And she basically said to her, like, I'm glad you're doing so well, but you're never going to be like in a museum and stuff like, are you okay with that? And, the woman's response was like, it's fine. Like, I'm here to make money. And I have thought about that for years and years because I didn't understand. I kept being like, well, if she can sell so much work, why is it not museum quality? Like, what makes it? And now I get it because it's aesthetic. People love it. They want it for their homes. They're happy to hang it in their homes. It's beautiful work. But there isn't the intellectual content, and or she's not pushing herself to make the work fall into one of those kind of categories to show at the kind of places where that would be, you'd fall that way. And she's happy with where she is, so there's no need to move it in a different direction. And I think like that's my biggest takeaway, is that the categories aren't in a hierarchy. They aren't stacked on top of each other in a pyramid. The categories exist in a row, four boxes, and you can move between
or
the
maybe
boxes, you can mush the
circle,
boxes
because to me,
together.
it go from one to another and backwards and forwards in this circle.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Maybe it's more like you're looking at four boxes on the floor in a square, and they're sort of next to each other in a square, and they, you move them around playing three card Monty, uh, you know, like that.
Boxes.
And it's, well, you know what I meant. But yeah, so, and that it's not that anything is better or on top, it's whatever you want. The category you want is probably the one that you're putting at the top,
One of the
you
things this
know?
makes me think of, for example, going back to like your theater work, there are people who are content to be character actors. They
Mhm,
don't particularly want to be, followed by the paparazzi on the street. They want to act, they want to contribute to whatever
mhm,
project they're in, but they don't necessarily desire to be the ingenue or the leading man or any of that. And they are often superb actors. So you can choose not to go for the maximum amount of money. That should not be a scale of how good you are at what you've chosen to do. And I
I have to
think
say, I find it so interesting that you keep bringing the conversation around to money every single time. But
I
yes.
really think that a lot of the discussion around the art world nowadays is around money,
Mhm.
is driven by money. And uh, how much something sells for is really what a lot of people's interest is in art.
Well, disappointing for them, isn't it? Because again, like I've never understood that. There's like the art has become an investment market, and there are all sorts of articles and stuff about how that means that people buy art and basically they don't put it in their homes, they don't display it, they put it in a safe, you know, temperature protected warehouse somewhere and keep it as an investment. Not my kind of thing, but hey, more power to you. If you got the billions of dollars, I guess you got to find a way to make even more. So we'll just wrap up the conversation. If you have some thoughts on this, I'd love to hear. Again, you can see the original post all at Louise R. Mayhew, Mayhew, on her Instagram. I read all the posts, all the Instagrams. You can see all the charts that she made. It's just very interesting to see. Okay, practical colors for painters is ongoing. Color is a foundational part of making art. You can join me for a wonderful interactive workshop that breaks down all of the complicated ideas into simple and practical lessons. And if you want to connect, you can find me at juliebalzer.com or all over social media as at Balzer Designs. Please do sign up for the free weekly newsletter. That's the best way to make sure you keep up on the latest news. There's a big button on the homepage of juliebalzer.com where you can do that, or you can go to the show page for this podcast to find the link. If you'd like to help the show, we would love that. You can leave a review, you can mention us on social media, tell a friend, tell a bird. All of those things help other people find the show, which is the goal. So thank you so much for listening and subscribing. We'll see you the next time on the Adventures in Arting podcast.